My name is Thomas Graff. I'm a doctoral student at the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. My work focuses on Christology in Dante and Augustine. And I'll let my friend Matthew introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matthew Rothaus Moser. I'm assistant professor of theology in the Honors College at Azusa Pacific University, and I work on the theology of contemplation and the imagination.
So we have the distinct privilege of reading through and commenting very briefly upon Paradiso 20 as part of this larger commentary pilgrimage through Dante's Commedia. So our title for you all today is Data mi fu suave medicina, Recovering Predestination in the Heaven of Justice. So our attempt, kind of both of us are approaching this a bit more theologically. We wanted to kind of frame our conversation in terms of predestination. So this heavily fraught, contested, but also very interesting generative theological term in the Christian tradition was kind of our impetus for thinking about what kind of theological point is at stake in this particular canto. So if God's predestining will is unknowable, because as we've seen in Paradise 19, it lies in absolute excess of creation's comprehension of finite understanding of the divine will, and therefore acts inscrutably in history, one of the conclusions that many readers take away from 19 is that, and now in 20, that God prefers to save some righteous pagans, Trajan and Ripheus, and not others, right? And this is the major kind of dramatic question about Virgil. And so this message that many take away is that this mystery of salvation and the gift of divine love is at worst tragic for some, or at the very least arbitrary in its will to save some and not others. So our interest is this one attempt to maybe recover or rethink how predestination as a doctrine is functioning as a response or answer to this kind of long-term protest or interrogation that Dante holds before divine justice in this heaven of justice in Paradiso 20. And in fact, as our title, and we'll go into this further later, suggests with this suave medicina, Dante claims that the eagle's explanation or revelation of the salvation of Trajan and Ripheus was medicinal for him. It was kind of curative in this totally new way. He was healed of something in and through this encounter. So we want to kind of explore this medicinal quality of predestination in a couple forms. We'll talk a bit about wonder and its relationship to humility, and then ultimately about creativity. But to begin, kind of on the front end of this commentary, we wanted to dig a bit more into Trajan and Ripheus, some of their backstory, and why the eagle of justice, one of Dante's main interlocutor, is so fascinated and excited and filled with wonder over their salvations in particular. So I'll pass it first on to Matthew.
So our setting here with Trajan, especially, is Dante's drawing on a folk story and building upon a folk story in which Trajan, a virtuous pagan who died, went to limbo, is ultimately saved through the prayerful intervention of Pope Gregory the Great, who, so moved by Trajan's justice in life, turns to God in prayer, intercedes for Trajan to indeed be saved. And here Dante is confronted with Trajan, not in limbo among the virtuous pagans, but among the saved and the blessed souls in the eyebrow of the eagle. We will also talk about Ripheus, if Thomas, you want to tell us a bit about what Ripheus is doing here.
I'll try to riff a bit on. Yes,
indeed, yes.
But I'm happy to. Yeah, so I will read through just one of the main passages speaking on both of their salvation stories, essentially, from lines 106 to 123. And so we'll be using the Hollander translation for this as well. Che l'una dello inferno uno si riede, giammai a buon voler, tornò all'ossa, e ciò di viva spene fu mercede. Di viva spene che mise la possa, ne preghi fatti a Dio per suscitarla, sì che potesse sua voglia esser mossa. L'anima gloriosa, onde si parla, tornata nella carne, finché fu poco, credette in lui che potea aiutarla, e credendo s'accese in tanto fuoco di vero amor, che alla morte seconda fu degna di venire a questo gioco. L'altra per grazie che da sì profonda fontana stilla, che mai creatura non pinse l'occhio fino alla prima onda, tutto suo amor laggiù pose addirittura, perché di grazia in grazia Dio gli aperse l'occhio alla nostra redenzione futura. So the translation here: for from hell, where no one may return to righteous will, the one came back to his bones, and this is Trajan. This his reward for living hope, the living hope that furnished power to the prayers addressed to God to raise him from the dead so that his will might find its moving force. The blessed soul of whom I speak, back in his flesh but for a while, believed in him who had the power to help, and believing was kindled to such fire of the one true love that, on his second death, he was deemed worthy to enjoy our happiness. The other soul through grace, which wells up from a source so deep there, never was a creature who could thrust his vision to its primal spring, set all his love below in righteousness. And for that reason, from grace to grace, God opened his eyes to our redemption yet to come. So why is Ripheus significant here in particular? Ripheus is a character from Virgil's Aeneid who, although renowned for a life of justice, is killed tragically in battle. And this is a death with which Virgil further attributes in a parenthetical to the blind will of the pagan gods. So although it's interesting now to then see it placed in this medieval context, here the figure of Ripheus in Dante's Commedia is saved by the Christian God rather than damned by the pagan gods in the original text, and is one of the greatest causes for celebration and wonder before God's predestining will. So whereas he once in Virgil memorialized the indifference of capricious gods in the face of human justice, Dante's Ripheus overthrows that paradigm, witnessing to this deep harmony obtaining between human and divine justice. Through his love for justice, the eagle claims that God directly infused in him the supernatural grace of charity that brought him to salvation.
And so Dante is confronted here, Dante the Pilgrim is confronted here with this question of how can the virtuous pagans be saved? And this puts him in a position of shock and wonder. And this is the beginning of what we call Dante's recovery of the doctrine of predestination. So what we wanted to do is look a little bit more closely at the Pilgrim's response to this surprise of having Trajan and Ripheus among the blessed. And I think that what we begin to see is this overarching movement within the Pilgrim from shock and wonder to a kind of humility, to a kind of praise. And so in line 82, when the Pilgrim first sees this eyebrow of the eagle in which Trajan and Ripheus are blinking in harmony with the song of the eagle, he says, "How can this be? How can this be?" And we hear a kind of shock, a kind of surprise, but it's a holy surprise. It's a holy shock because it's generative. It's generative for the Pilgrim's further understanding. The Pilgrim, up to this point, especially in Cantos 19 and 20, is approaching these theological questions of salvation and predestination in explanatory mode, trying to understand it, trying to explain it. But here we have this shock and this wonder. And this is where we begin to see the Pilgrim pivoting from trying to explain and comprehend God's will to humbly receiving it and praising it. So the Pilgrim's expectations and his categories for salvation are kind of confounded here. Mm-hmm. And this creates in him a kind of humble openness to the mystery of God. Rather than trying to explain the mystery, he is learning to praise the mystery. And you see this wonderful movement in line 75 as well, where the eagle, this creature that is so known for its penetrating vision, that's being tied to contemplation, contemplative understanding, It says, like the lark who soars in the air for singing and silent content and rejoicing in the final joyous sweetness of its song. You have this movement from the glorious contemplative eagle to this humble lark, content to just sing and praise. And I think the pilgrim himself takes this movement into his own character, and he becomes content to simply sing the song of God's predestination. In order to do that, he has to be confounded and embrace the kind of humility of not being able to understand God's will, but being able to apprehend it and delight in it.
And this is one of these important shifts that I think Dante is trying to push the reader to, from thinking about theology, thinking about salvation, not merely as kind of propositional content to cogitate or to fully explain, as if, reflection on the nature of God were merely propositional, something that could be fully expressed in language, but rather thinking more about the form of reflection. What kind of person does the Christian need to be in order to enter into the divine life, in order to think in and as part of this salvific ecclesial communal life? What kind of humility does one need to develop or inculcate in order to open oneself beyond one's ego into this life that extends beyond one's own understanding? And this, one word that I've kind of fascinated and wrestled with for a while is this term sospeso in line 87. And then this is 85 to 87. And then its eye lit up with greater brilliance. The blessed emblem to set me free from suspense and wonder gave its answer. Per non tenermi in admirar sospeso. So there's something, I think there's this important disruption that this canto is trying to effect in these usual explanatory frameworks, or a desire for full, exhaustive comprehension of the workings of God to man. And an invitation into this new space of wonder, and then ultimately of participation in God's kind of creative divine life. And all of this wrapped up within what it means to participate in the doctrine of predestination or be implicated within it.
Yeah, and it seems like Dante is pushing the theology of predestination to not simply be about what God is doing, but how we can attune ourselves to God. There's a wonderful echo of Picarda's famous line that our will aligns with God. In God's will is our peace, and this is in line 138. For that which God wills, we will too. And so part of what's happening in this canto is the alignment of the pilgrim's will with the will of God. And that happens through his the medicine of humility, the medicine of wonder, of suspension, the medicine that is ultimately going to lead him to praise and creativity.
I can read that. So that passage, another one we wanted to emphasize, which ends with that citation of Suave Medicina, is lines 130 to 141. And it starts, and this is the great kind of apostrophe to predestination. O predestinazione, quanto rimota è la radice tua da quegli aspetti che la prima cagion non veggion tota. E voi mortali tenetevi stretti a giudicar, che noi che Dio vedemmo non conosciamo ancor tutti gli eletti. E venne dolce così fatto scemo, perché il ben nostro in questo ben s'affina, che quel che vuole è Dio e noi volemmo. Così da quell'immagine divina per farmi chiara la mia corta vista, data mi fu suave medicina. Matt, do you want to read through the translation there?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. O predestination, how distant is your root from the gaze of those who cannot grasp the primal cause in its entirety. And you mortals, find some restraint in making judgments, for we who gaze on God have yet to know all those who are elect. And to us this very lack is sweet, because in this good is our good perfected. For that which God wills, we will too. Thus did that holy image, to cure the shortness of my vision, apply sweet medication to my eyes.
And Matthew, something else that we were just briefly discussing was kind of the moral aspect of this medicine as well. This sweet medication to his eyes also has to do with human judgment and actively judging others and restraining that impulse to condemn. And this comes up in those great lines 133 to 134. And you mortals find some restraint in making judgments.
Yeah, and instead of there being a kind of weaponizing of the theology of predestination to claim who's in and who's out, that there is instead this humble embrace of the fact that our vision can't penetrate into God's will. Even among the blessed, we saw or that we will see in subsequent cantos, they still can't comprehend the eternal will of God. It remains a mystery, but it precisely because it's a mystery that's not to be solved, it opens up these new horizons for creativity, for grace, for creating new ways of relating to the world via prayer and intercession, like we see between Gregory and Trajan.
Right. And this isn't, to emphasize, like, this isn't some form of kind of conceptual or theological obscurantism. This is, very directly an invitation to then participate in the ecclesial life of the church and ultimately the body of Christ. And so one of the ways that we wanted to kind of talk about that is in terms of creativity. So this cooperation between the human and divine, humanity as the kind of that second causality of entering into the divine life in a new way. And this comes up most forcefully in lines 94 to 9, the last kind of passage we'll think about here. And it begins, Regnum celorum violenza pate da caldo amore e da viva speranza, che vince la divina volontate. Non a guisa che l'uomo ha l'om sobranza, ma vince lei perché vuole essere vinta, e vinta vince con sua benignanza. So what's interesting here is that this is even a critique of human violence as a way of solving conflict, of a kind of failure of this harmony of wills. God's salvific will is won over by the warmth of love and living hope, not as a contest of wills, because God desires to be won over by prayers for grace, and in being won over, wins back humanity to himself. It's an intentional subversion of this language of winning and losing, of the kind of agonistic human relationships of violence and coercion, towards a different form of non-competitive relationship, as some theologians will point to, between humanity and divinity. And it's striking that there's the allusion to the Regnum Celorum. This is a biblical citation of Matthew 11:12, in which Jesus refers to the persecution of Christians. The quote is, "From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been subjected to violence, and violent people have been raiding it." So what does predestination is this kind of invitation into a new form of creative attunement and creative action within the divine life, and ultimately within the life of Caritas, that can even go to the limits and kind of the peripheries of extremities of human violence, and even turn those very punitive cyclical dynamics on their head, and invite new forms, creative forms of human relationship.
And I'm struck by your use of the word attunement there, Thomas, because that's the language with which the canto ends. Again, we have this music, this sweet sound, in which the images of a practiced lute player follows a practiced singer, and we get the picture of the lights of Trajan and Ruffius pulsating in attunement, in harmony with this song, this praise of predestination. And that's almost a kind of foretaste of the pilgrim's own attunement with the will of God that will move him along with the entire cosmos at the end of the poem.
And that also that emphasis within that kind of image, that the life of hope is always necessarily relational and communal. It hopes not only for oneself, but in love also for the other as another self, or as implicated in the life of Christ. And in that sense, creates a world that was heretofore impossible, unforeseeable, or unknowable, perhaps, or which maybe one had despaired of, right? It creates, in that kind of Dantean phrase, new life between individuals. And so in that sense, I think points to how Dante is savoring this new reality, or to live within that kind of community of kinship is radically foreign from the life of violence, the life of kind of bitter judgment. And that is a different kind of medicine for the soul here that he's trying to point to, perhaps.
Yes.
I mean, 100 different things to talk about more, but we might kind of cap it there. Thank you so much to the organizers, to Professor Allison Cornish, NYU Italian Studies, and looking forward to seeing the other videos.
Thank you.
Thank you.